My name is Nathan, and I want to tell you a story about patience, because patience is the most misunderstood weapon a person can carry. We treat it like a soft thing, a virtue for people who lack the nerve to fight. But the truth is that patience is the sharpest edge there is, and the people who know how to hold it can beat almost anyone. This is a story about a quiet man who spent his life repairing old books and old paper, a man his own family had written off as harmless and slow. It is also a story about a dying woman who understood her children better than they understood themselves, and who spent years building a trap so patient, so careful, that it could only be sprung after she was gone. There is a forged will in this story. There is an affair nobody was supposed to find. There is a note left on a child's desk that was meant to wound, and did. But there is also a sealed letter, waiting in the dark, and a father who read it and smiled. I'm not going to tell you how it ends. I only ask that you notice, as we go, who is rushing and who is waiting. Because in the end, that is the whole story. The Ravenel house sat at the top of Calderwood, Vermont, on a rise where the maples turned early, and the wind came off the ridge with a smell of wood smoke and cold water. It was a big, plain, honest house, built by a man named Landon Ravenel more than half a century back, and everyone in town knew it, the way people in small towns know the old houses. What they did not know, most of them, was how much of Calderwood the family that lived in it actually owned. That was the way Eleanor Ravenel had always wanted it. She was 79 now, and dying, and she had spent the better part of 40 years making sure that the things she had built could not be easily seen, or easily taken. Landon Ravenel had moved back into the caretaker's wing of that house 8 months before, when the doctors first used the word that changes everything. He was 43, a widower, a soft-spoken man with reading glasses pushed up into his graying hair and ink under his fingernails that never quite washed out. In the town he was known, if he was known at all, as the man who ran the little shop on the corner of Ash Street, Ravenel Bindery and Paper Conservation, where he rebound family Bibles and mended water-damaged deeds and, now and then, took the train down to Boston to tell an auction house whether a manuscript was what it claimed to be. He was good at it, better than anyone knew. He could tell you the decade a sheet of paper was made in by the feel of it between two fingers, name the mill by the watermark, the ink by the way it aged, the forger by the confidence of a signature written too fast. His daughter Cora was 11, and she had come with him, of course. She was a sharp, watchful girl with her mother's dark eyes and her grandmother's habit of going very still when the adults thought she was not listening. She set up her homework at a little desk in the caretaker's wing, under a lamp her father had rewired himself, and she went in every afternoon to sit with her grandmother. That surprised people. Eleanor Ravenel was not a soft woman, not the kind of grandmother who baked, but she and Cora understood each other in a way that needed very few words, and the old woman seemed to save her best hours for the girl. Landon was the third of Eleanor's 4 children, and he had always been the one nobody worried about, which is a polite way of saying the one nobody thought about at all. His eldest brother Judah had the loud voice and the big plans. His sister Constance had the ambitions, the careful clothes, the way of walking into a room as though it had been expecting her. His younger brother Elliot had the nerves, the apologies, the vague sense of always being late for something. And Landon had the books. When their father died and the others circled the estate like weather, Landon had said almost nothing, taken almost nothing, and gone back to his shop. The family read this as weakness. Eleanor read it differently. She had watched all 4 of her children for a lifetime and had come to a conclusion that broke her heart and sharpened her mind in equal measure. 3 of them would ruin anything she gave them and ruin each other to get it, and only one had never once asked her for a thing. She did not tell Landon that. She was not sentimental about it, and she did not want him behaving differently because he knew. Instead, over years, she made arrangements. Long, quiet, careful arrangements, the kind that do not show up at dinner. She consolidated. She bought the tired commercial block downtown one storefront at a time, over a decade, never all at once, never under her own loud name, until she owned nearly the whole face of Ash Street, including the corner building with the good brick and the restaurant on the ground floor, the place everyone in Calderwood called Mario's. She held the rare book and manuscript collection that Alaric had started, and she had grown. A collection worth, if you knew what you were looking at, more than the house and the land together. And she held the house itself. She held all of it, the way she held everything, close and unshowy, and she made a will. Then, near the end, she did something that Landon would not understand for months. On an afternoon in late winter, with the light going blue in the windows, she asked Cora to come sit close, and she took a sealed envelope from the drawer of the table by her bed. It was heavy paper, folded and sealed with a bead of dark wax, and it had the girl's name on it in Eleanor's own steady hand. "This is yours to keep," the old woman said. "Not your father's. Yours. You are going to hide it somewhere only you know, and you are not going to give it to him, no matter how sad he gets, no matter how much you want to make him feel better." "You wait," Cora asked her, in the way of 11-year-olds. Wait for what? And Eleanor Ravenel, who had spent 40 years learning exactly what her own children were, smiled a little and said, "You'll know. You wait until they show you who they are, until the very worst thing. Then you give it to him." Cora nodded, because when her grandmother spoke like that, you did not argue. And she took the letter, and she hid it, and she told no one. Eleanor died 3 weeks later, in the gray hour before dawn, with Landon holding one hand, and Cora asleep in the chair. She went the way she had lived, without fuss, having arranged everything, having warned the one person she trusted and no one else. And in the days after, as the house filled with flowers and casseroles and the particular greed that death brings out in some families like a rash, Landon did not yet know that his mother had left him anything at all except a grief he did not know how to set down. He only knew that she was gone, and that the house felt enormous and wrong, and that his daughter kept looking at him with an expression he could not read, as if she were carrying something too heavy for her, and had been told not to put it down. The decline had been slow, and then it had not been. Eleanor had made one thing very clear to Landon in her last lucid weeks, and she had made him promise it. The funeral was to be held out of state, at a small chapel near the coast in Maine, where she and Alaric had married, and it was to be a plain graveside affair, no reception, no gathering back at the house. Landon thought at the time that it was sentiment, an old woman wanting to be buried near the sea, and the memory of her wedding. He understood only later that it was something else. His mother had wanted her 3 greedy children out of Calderwood, away from the house, on a specific day she could not control from the grave, but could at least aim. She had bought a window of time. She was still, even dead, arranging the board. Because the truth was that Judah and Constance and Elliot had not been able to grieve honestly, not even at the beginning. Judah had shown up at the house 2 days after the death, in a car that cost more than most people in Calderwood made in 3 years. And within an hour he was in the study, running his hand along the spines of the collection, pulling volumes out, holding them up to the light. He did not know what any of them were worth. He only knew they were worth something, and that the something was now, in his mind, partly his. Landon had watched him from the doorway and said nothing. He had learned long ago that saying nothing to Judah was the only thing that did not feed him. What Landon did not know, what almost no one knew, was how badly Judah needed it. The flashy business, the marina development up on the lake that Judah talked about at every holiday, as though it were already built, was a hole in the ground and a pile of debt. He had personally guaranteed loans he could not cover. He had borrowed from people who did not send polite letters. For 2 years he had been living on the promise of his mother's estate, telling himself and telling his creditors, in careful language, that money was coming, that it was only a matter of time, that his mother was old and rich and would not last. He had begun, quietly, to plan around an inheritance he did not yet have and was not, in fact, going to get. Constance did not need money the way Judah needed it, but she needed the appearance of money, the way some people need air. She had married Beckham Pyle, a pleasant, hollow man who managed other people's investments and agreed with whoever had spoken last, and together they had built a life that looked expensive from the outside and felt anxious from the inside. When she thought of her mother's estate, she thought of the house, the good address, the collection she could mention at dinner parties without ever having read a page of it, the standing it would give her. She had already, in her head, redecorated. And then there was the lawyer. Sinclair Beaumont was the family's estate attorney, a smooth, expensive man with a good tailor and a way of touching your elbow when he talked to you, and he had been hovering around Eleanor for the last 2 years, with a solicitude that Landon had found faintly nauseating and had assumed was ordinary lawyer's greed. It was more than that. Beaumont had, sometime in that final year, begun an affair with Judah's wife, Adelia, a cold and beautiful woman who had married Judah for the marina money that turned out not to exist and had been looking, ever since, for an exit that did not cost her anything. The two of them, the lawyer and the brother's wife, had found in each other a shared and useful appetite, and somewhere in the long months of Eleanor's dying, they had begun to talk, in the low voices of people who have decided to do something, about what the old woman's estate was actually worth, and about how much of it might be steered, with the right documents, into the right hands. Elliot, the youngest, was the only one of the three who could not look at any of it straight. He had always been the soft one, the apologizer, the boy who cried at the wrong times and could not hold a grudge or a plan. He drank a little too much at the funeral in Maine and said, to no one, that Mom had always known what she was doing, and Judah told him to sit down. Elliot sat down, but something in him had already started to come loose, some thread that would, in time, unravel the whole thing. He did not know yet what his brothers and Constance and Beckham and Adelia and the lawyer were building. He only knew that he felt sick, and that he had felt sick for a while, and that his mother, in one of her last clear moments, had looked at him with a terrible gentleness and said, "You're not like them, Elliot. You just have to decide it once." He had not understood what she meant. He was going to. The funeral in Maine was on a Thursday. Landon had planned to stay through Saturday, to help close up the little rented cottage where the family had gathered, and to give Cora, who had cried herself sick, another 2 days by the sea before the long drive home. But on Friday morning he woke early with a wrongness he could not name, the specific animal certainty that something at home was not right, and he could not shake it. He told the others he was leaving early. Judah barely looked up. Constance said something about how he always did leave early, from everything, in a voice pitched to be heard. Landon put his daughter and their 2 bags in the car and drove the long way back through the mountains, into Vermont, into the dark, and arrived at the Ravenel house a full day before anyone expected him. The house was black. Not merely dark, the way a house is at night, but black in the specific way of a house where someone has gone through and made a decision about the lights. He let them in through the side door of the caretaker's wing and reached for the switch out of 40 years of habit, and nothing happened. He tried another. Nothing. He stood in the cold hall with his daughter's hand in his and felt the first true prickle of something worse than grief. And then he heard it, a small mechanical click and a faint bloom of light from down the hall, and he followed it, and there was Cora, who had gone ahead of him, standing in the doorway of her little room. She had already found her flashlight. She had it propped on a stack of books, aimed at the desk, and her homework was open under it, half finished, as though she had been working there in the dark for some time and had simply learned to. Landon went down to the old panel in the basement with the flashlight and found what he already knew he would find. The main house had power. The breakers that fed the caretaker's wing, their wing, his and Cora's, had been thrown. Not tripped. Thrown. Deliberately. The little switches all pushed hard to off, and someone had put a strip of tape across them so that a person coming down in a hurry would not simply flip them back without thinking. It was a small, mean, specific act, and it had been done by someone with a key to the house and time to do it, someone who had come while the family was in Maine burying the woman who had raised them. And taped to the panel, at eye level, where he could not miss it, was a note. He read it by flashlight. He recognized Constance's handwriting, the careful, upright letters she was so proud of. "Celebrating the will at Mario's," it said. "They get nothing, neither do you." That was all. No signature, no explanation. Just the flat, delighted cruelty of it. The fact that they had wanted him to find it, had wanted him to stand exactly where he was standing, in the cold and the dark of the house he had spent 8 months living in so he could hold his mother's hand while she died, and understand that they had won and that they were, at that very moment, a mile down the hill, toasting it in a restaurant. Landon stood there a long time. He was a man who had spent his whole life not reacting, and even now, with the note in his hand and the blood going loud in his ears, he did not shout, did not throw anything, did not do any of the things the note was designed to make him do. He folded it once, along its existing crease, the way you handle a document you may need later. And he put it in his shirt pocket. Then he went back up the stairs to his daughter. Cora was still standing by her desk. She had turned off the flashlight to save the batteries and was waiting for him in the gray light from the window, and there was something in her face, something that had been building for weeks, that he finally understood was not just grief. She looked at him, and she looked at the pocket where he had put the note, and she seemed to make a decision. She went to the bookshelf, to a fat dictionary she never used, and she took out from between its pages a heavy folded envelope, sealed with dark wax, with her own name on it in her grandmother's hand. "Grandma gave me this," she said. Her voice was very steady, steadier than his would have been. "Before she died, she said to keep it and not give it to you, no matter how sad you got. She said to wait until they showed you who they are, until the worst thing." She held it out to him with both hands. "I think this is the worst thing." Landon took the envelope. He looked at his mother's handwriting, and for a moment, the whole cold house seemed to tilt around him. He broke the seal in the light of his daughter's flashlight, and he unfolded the pages, and he read. And after a moment, standing in the dark of the wing they had shut the power to, holding the letter his mother had aimed across the last months of her life at exactly this moment, Landon Ravenel began, very quietly, to smile. The letter was 3 pages, in his mother's clear, steady hand, and it did not open with grief or with anger. It opened with an apology, of a kind. "I'm sorry you had to find something cruel before you found this," Eleanor had written. "But you had to. I needed them to do it first. I needed you to see it, and I needed it to be real, before I told you what I've done. Because if I had told you while I was alive, you would have tried to make peace. You would have tried to be fair, and they would have taken everything, and they would have taken it from Cora, and they would have called it love." Landon read that standing up, and then he sat down on the edge of Cora's bed and read the rest. His mother had laid it out plainly. She named names. She wrote that she had watched Judah bleed money into a project that would never be built and lie about it to everyone including himself, that she had heard from her own bank about the loans he was trying to guarantee against her death. She wrote that Constance had asked her, more than once, in that particular sideways way of hers, about the arrangements, and that she had learned to tell when her daughter was pricing a room. She wrote that she did not trust Sinclair Beaumont, that she had felt his interest in her affairs grow warmer as she grew sicker, and that she had a suspicion she could not prove but did not doubt, which was that the lawyer and Adelia had grown close in a way that was not about law. "I am an old woman, and I notice things," she wrote. "I have always noticed things. It is the only thing I have ever been truly good at." And then she told him what she had done. Years ago, quietly, without a word to anyone in the family, she had gone around Beaumont entirely. She had engaged an independent trust officer, a fiduciary named Sable Whitcomb, a woman with no connection to Calderwood and no stake in the family's affections, and she had, with Sable's help, drawn up her true will and, more importantly, created an irrevocable trust. Into that trust she had placed the things that mattered: the downtown block on Ash Street, the corner building with Mario's in it, the house and its land, and the manuscript collection. The trust named a single beneficiary. It was not Landon, it was Cora. And it named a single trustee, the person who would manage it all until the girl came of age and hold it in her interest, and answer to her and to the law and to no one else. That was Landon. "I did not leave it to you," his mother wrote, "because if I leave it to you, they will spend the rest of your life dragging you through courtrooms to take it, and you are too decent and too tired to enjoy fighting them. I left it to your daughter, in a trust they cannot break, held by a stranger's hand until the day I die, and I made you the one who holds it for her. They cannot buy Cora, they cannot flatter her or shame her or wear her down, and you will not fight them for yourself. I know you won't, you never have, but you will fight them for her. You will fight them like a wolf for her, and you will be patient, because you are always patient, and patience is the only thing that beats people like your brother, who cannot wait for anything." Landon read that line twice. There was more. His mother had anticipated, with a clarity that was almost frightening, exactly what would happen after she was gone. She predicted that Beaumont would produce a new will, dated in her final year, splitting the estate 3 ways among Judah and Constance and Elliot, and cutting Landon out entirely, most likely by painting him as an estranged son, a lie so complete It was almost funny given that he was the one who had moved in to nurse her. "They will forge it," she wrote, "and they will do it badly, because they are lazy and greedy and in a hurry, and because they think you are a small man who mends books. They have never once understood what you actually do. You are going to let them file it. Do you hear me, Landon? Do not stop them. Let them commit the whole crime, on paper, in front of a judge, before you say a single word. Sable has the real will and the trust documents, lodged and witnessed years ago, where no one can touch them. When you have let them show the world the forgery, you will bring her the truth, and you will bring them down with it, all at once, and it will be clean." She had even, and this was the part that made Landon set the pages down and press his hand over his mouth for a moment, made a recording. Sable held it. A short video, Eleanor had explained, made in the trust officer's presence and witnessed, in which she stated plainly who she was and of what mind, described the true will and the trust, and predicted, on the record, that after her death a false will would appear, forged, most likely by her own attorney, and that it should be treated as the crime it was. She had, in other words, testified from beyond the grave, before the crime was even committed, that it was coming. She had built a trap and then filmed herself describing it, so that when her greedy children walked into it, there could be no possibility, none, that a jury would think it an accident or a misunderstanding. The last paragraph was for him. "You spent your whole life being the one nobody watched," she wrote. "I watched. I know what you are. You are the most dangerous kind of person there is, the kind who is never in a hurry. So take your time. Let them gloat. Let Judah borrow against a fortune he'll never see. Let Constance tell the whole town. Let that lawyer file his lie and let it dry on the page. And when the moment is exactly right, and not one day before, you end it. Kiss Cora for me. She is the best of all of us. She'll keep the letter. She always knew how to wait." It was signed, simply, Mom. Landon sat in the dark for a while with the pages in his lap and his daughter watching him. Then he folded the letter, and he put it back in its envelope, and he handed it to Cora. "Put it back where you had it," he said. "We're going to need it later." "You did exactly right." And Cora, who had carried the thing for weeks and told no one, finally let her shoulders come down. In the morning, Landon flipped the breakers back on, peeled the tape off the panel, and drove down Ash Street past Mario's, where a valet was already parked out front for the celebration to come, and he did not slow down. He had a phone call to make. Her name was Sable Whitcomb, and she was, his mother had written, expecting to hear from him. The forged will surfaced 11 days after the funeral. Sinclair Beaumont filed it with the Calderwood Probate Court with a great show of reluctant gravity, as though it pained him to be the bearer of such a document, and he sent copies to all the interested parties, including, with a note of oily regret, to Landon. It was, on its face, everything Eleanor had predicted. It was dated the previous spring, in her final year. It left the estate in 3 equal shares to Judah, Constance, and Elliot. It made no provision for Cora at all. And it contained a paragraph, drafted with real venom, that described Landon as an estranged son from whom the deceased had grown regretfully but permanently distant, and left him a single $1, in acknowledgement that a mother's door, though he chose not to walk through it, was never fully closed. Landon read that paragraph 3 times, and each time it made him angrier, and each time he let the anger settle back down, because his mother had told him to wait, and because the paragraph, in its cruelty, was also a mistake. It was too much. Forgers who are confident always do too much. He did not go to Beaumont. He did not go to his brother's. He took the document into his own shop on Ash Street, into the back room where the good light was, the room with the loops and the raking lamps and the ultraviolet lights and the reference books that told you when every paper mill in New England had opened and closed. And he sat down with the forged will the way he had sat down with 1,000 suspect manuscripts, and he began, patiently, to take it apart. The paper was his first friend. It was good paper, cream-laid stock, the kind a fine stationer would sell, chosen to look like the sort of thing a wealthy old woman might have her will printed on. But Landon knew paper the way a sommelier knows wine, and this paper was wrong in a way that only a handful of people in the country would have caught. He knew the manufacturer. He knew the line. And he knew, because he had reason to know, that this particular finish, this specific brightening agent in the pulp, had not been on the market until months after the date typed at the top of the document. The will claimed to have been signed in the spring of the previous year. The paper it was printed on had not existed until the autumn. That alone, if he could document it, and he could, was a knife through the whole thing. The ink was his second friend. The signatures, his mother's, and the two witnesses, were in a blue-black gel ink, and Landon put them under magnification and under ultraviolet, and saw, with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching a lie come apart in his hands, that the formulation was modern, a pigment blend he could place, that had likewise post-dated the supposed signing. Worse for the forgers, the ink sat on top of the toner from the printed text in a way that told him the signatures had been added after the body of the document was printed, which was ordinary enough, except that the toner itself carried a batch signature he could trace, and the printer that had laid it down was not the sort of machine a careful estate attorney kept in his office for wills. It was a common office laser. He could even, given time and a subpoena, likely identify the specific machine. The watermark finished it. Held to the light, the paper carried the faint device of its mill, and Landon knew that mills marks the way you know the faces of your family. Mills changed their dandy rolls, and this one had changed theirs. The watermark on the forged will belonged to a run of paper manufactured, he was nearly certain, more than a year after the date on the document. He photographed all of it, in raking light and transmitted light and ultraviolet, with a scale bar in every frame, the way you build a record that will survive a hostile lawyer and a skeptical judge. Then he sat back and understood that his mother had been right about everything, including the part where they would do it badly, because they had done it badly, and Landon was beginning to see why. There was a haste to the forgery, a sloppiness, that spoke of people who were sure they would never be checked. Beaumont was a good lawyer and a careful man in most things, but the will had the fingerprints of someone working fast and cutting corners. And as Landon turned it over in his mind, he thought about the affair his mother had named, and he began to see the shape of it. Beaumont and Adelia. If they were lovers, and if Adelia had access to Eleanor's home and Eleanor's papers and specimens of Eleanor's signature on old letters and cards, then the pieces fit. Adelia had the raw material, the genuine signatures to copy. Beaumont had the legal cover, the ability to file the thing with a straight face and shepherd it through probate. And the two of them, together, had a reason to want the estate split 3 ways among the siblings rather than left honestly. Because a Judah suddenly flush with inheritance was a Judah whose failing marriage might limp on, but a Judah drowning while the estate money flowed sideways through the right channels was a Judah his wife could leave, rich, when the time came. Landon did not have proof of all of it yet, but he had the shape of it, and the shape was ugly, and it explained the haste. There was one more thing he noticed, the kind of small human detail his mother would have appreciated. On the second page, in the margin, there was the faintest impression, an indentation with no ink, the ghost of writing pressed through from a sheet that had lain on top of this one. Landon raised it with oblique light. It looked like a partial draft, a crossed-out line, a version of the estranged son paragraph phrased slightly differently, angrier, as though someone had written it out longhand first and reworked it. Someone had sat at a desk and composed the lie, and pressed hard enough that the page beneath remembered it. That, too, went into the record. He did not tell his brothers what he had found. He told no one but Cora, who he judged had earned the truth and could keep it, and who listened to her father explain paper mills and watermarks with the grave attention of a girl who had already proven she knew how to hold a secret. What Landon did, instead, was watch. He watched the celebration at Mario's become the talk of the town, because Constance could not help herself. He watched Judah start to move like a man who believed he was rich, and he began, carefully, to build the thing that would end them, which required, above all, that he do the hardest thing his mother had asked of him. It required that he wait. Landon's first move after the shop was not against his family. It was toward 2 people. The first was Sable Whitcomb, the trust officer, whom he drove 90 minutes south to meet in a plain office in a plain building, and who turned out to be a compact, unsmiling woman in her 60s, with the steadiness of someone who had spent her career being the person other people could not corrupt. She had been waiting, she said, for 8 years, in the sense that Eleanor had set all of this up 8 years before and had told her, simply, that one day the woman's son Landon would come, and that when he did, Sable was to give him everything. She had the true will, executed and witnessed and dated years earlier, long before the paper the forgery was printed on had even been manufactured. She had the irrevocable trust naming Cora as beneficiary and Landon as trustee, and she had the recording. She played it for him in that plain office, and Landon watched his mother, thinner than he wanted to remember, but clear-eyed and dry and completely herself, look into the camera and calmly predict the crime that was, at that very moment, sitting photographed on his workbench back in Calderwood. When it was over, he had to sit still for a while. Sable let him. She was good at letting people sit still. The second person was Thea Kirsch, a probate litigation attorney 2 towns over whom Sable recommended, and whom Landon retained the same week. Thea was fast where Landon was slow, blunt where he was quiet, and she understood the case within 20 minutes of him laying the paper and the ink and the watermark on her conference table. But when he told her his plan, or rather his mother's, that they would sit on everything, let the forged will move through probate, let Judah leverage himself against a phantom inheritance, and let Constance broadcast the false victory across Calderwood, before they said one word, Thea put down her pen. You understand that's not how anyone does this. Normally we file our objection now. We stop the harm before it happens. And Landon said, I know. My mother didn't want to stop the harm. She wanted it on the record. She wanted them all the way in before we shut the door. Thea sat with that. Then she smiled, the slow smile of a litigator who has just realized her client handed her a much bigger win than she came in expecting, and said, Your mother should have been a lawyer. No, Landon said. She was better than that. She was patient. So they waited, and it was as hard as his mother had promised. Because waiting meant watching, and watching hurt. Landon watched Judah, buoyed by the forged will and the certainty of inheritance, go to a bank and, against the coming estate, arrange a bridge loan, a large one, to keep the marina project on life support and to hold off the creditors who had begun, at last, to lose their patience. This was the single most important thing that happened in those weeks, and it was entirely Judah's own doing. He borrowed real money, at real interest, secured against his expected share of an estate that a court had not yet awarded him and, if Landon and Thea did their work, never would. Every dollar he drew down was a dollar he would owe with nothing to pay it, a noose he was measuring and fitting to his own neck, in a hurry, because he could not wait, because he had never in his life been able to wait for anything. Landon knew about the loan because the same banker who had once quietly kept Eleanor informed still worked at the branch, and while he told Landon nothing improper, he did allow, over coffee, that certain members of the family seemed very confident about the future. That was all Landon needed to hear. He watched Constance too. She had begun to talk about the collection, and Landon learned through the town's own nervous system that she and Beckham were quietly reaching out to a Boston auction house about a valuation, with an eye towards selling. This alarmed him more than the loan, because the loan only hurt Judah, but a sale of the collection would scatter irreplaceable things his mother had spent 40 years gathering, and some of them could not be gotten back. He talked it over with Thea. They decided the risk was worth carrying a little longer, because a documented attempt to auction the collection under the authority of a forged will was, itself, more evidence of the fraud, more harm on the record, exactly what his mother had wanted. But he set a line in his mind. If the collection went up for actual sale, he would move early. He would not let his patience cost him the books. And then there was Elliot. Elliot came to the shop one gray afternoon, alone, and stood in the doorway of the bindery, not quite able to come in, turning his hat in his hands like a man in an old movie. He had not been sleeping. Landon could see that. Elliot said he did not understand what had happened with the will, that he had never known Mom to be angry at Landon, that it did not sound like her. That paragraph about the estranged son, none of it sounded like her, and that Judah had told him to be quiet and take his share, and stop asking questions, and that he could not stop asking questions. He said, at last, the thing he had come to say, which was, "Do you think there's something wrong with it, Landon?" The will. And Landon, who could have told him everything right there, who could have shown him the watermark and the ink and ended the man's misery, instead said, gently, "What do you think, Elliot?" And Elliot looked at the floor and said, "I think I've been sick to my stomach since the day they read it." Landon told him to hold on to that feeling. He told him a day was coming when he would need it. He did not say more, but he understood, watching his youngest brother go back out into the cold, that his mother had been right about him too, that Elliot was not like the others, that he only had to decide it once. Landon was going to give him the chance. The near disaster came in the 7th week, and it came from a direction Landon had not fully guarded. Beaumont, perhaps sensing that things were taking longer than they should, perhaps prodded by Adelia, decided to clean house. Landon learned of it because of the second conscience in the story, a young woman named Lisbeth Farrow, who was 24 years old and worked as Sinclair Beaumont's paralegal, and who had spent the last 2 months growing quietly and steadily, more afraid of what she was part of. Lisbeth had done the actual clerical work on the forged will. She had typed clean versions from Beaumont's handwritten drafts. She had watched Adelia come and go from the office at odd hours. She had, without quite letting herself think about why, made copies, extra copies, of the drafts as they evolved. The handwritten originals with their crossings out and reworked cruelties, the successive versions of the estranged son paragraph, and she had taken them home and put them in a shoebox in her closet, telling herself she was only being careful, the way you tell yourself things when you already know the truth. Then, in the 7th week, Beaumont told her to shred the file, all of it, the drafts, the working notes, everything but the final filed will. He said it was standard practice, cleaning up after a matter closed. Lisbeth knew it was not standard practice, and she made a decision that took more courage than anyone would ever fully credit her for. She shredded exactly what he watched her shred, a decoy stack of blank and irrelevant pages, and she kept the real drafts in the shoebox, and that night she looked up the name of the quiet man on Ash Street whose mother had died, the one the will had cut out, and she wrote down his shop's number and stared at it for 3 days before she called. When she finally came to the bindery, late, after the street was empty, she was shaking so badly she could barely get the shoebox out of her bag. Landon made her tea and did not rush her, and eventually she laid it all out on his workbench. The handwritten drafts in Beaumont's hand, the reworked paragraphs, the evolution of the lie, and, at the bottom, a single genuine article that made Landon go very still. An old birthday card from Eleanor to Adelia, years old, with Eleanor's real signature, creased and worn at one corner. It was, Lisbeth whispered, the card they had used, the specimen, the signature they had copied. Adelia had brought it in from the house, and now it sat on Landon's bench, the source of the forgery, physical proof linking the will not only to Beaumont's office, but to Judah's own wife. Landon looked at the card, and at the drafts, and at the terrified young woman across the bench, and he understood that his mother's trap had just been fitted with a second, sharper set of teeth that even Eleanor had not planned, provided by the conscience of a stranger. He told Lisbeth she had done a brave thing. He told her that she was going to be all right, that Thea Kirsch would protect her, that keeping evidence of a fraud was not a crime but part of it never had been hers, and he added her shoebox, carefully, to the record. The court date came in the 9th week, before Judge Merriman, in the small paneled probate courtroom in the Calderwood County seat. On the surface it was a routine hearing, the formal admission of the will Beaumont had filed, the sort of proceeding that usually took 20 minutes and ended with a signature. Judah and Constance came dressed for a coronation. Beckham came with them. Adelia came, sitting apart, cool and elegant, and bored, and Sinclair Beaumont came in his good suit with his good briefcase, prepared to present the will of the late Landon Ravenel and see it admitted, and to begin, at last, the distribution of an estate several of the people in that room had already spent. Elliot came too, pale, and sat at the end of the family row like a man waiting for a diagnosis. And Landon came, quietly, in a plain jacket, with Cora beside him because he had promised her she could be there, and with Thea Kirsch at the council table, and with 3 boxes. Beaumont rose and made his presentation, smooth as ever, describing the document, the estranged son, the equal division among the 3 deserving children. Judge Merriman, an old and unhurried man who had seen every kind of family destroy itself over money, listened without expression, and then asked, as a matter of routine, whether any interested party wished to be heard before the will was admitted. And Thea Kirsch stood up and said that yes, they did, and that they intended to contest the document as a forgery, and that they were prepared to prove it that morning. The temperature in the room changed. Beaumont's smile did not move, but something behind it did. Judah half rose and was told to sit. What followed was not a shouting match. It was worse than that, for them, because it was quiet, and it was documentary, and it was overwhelming. Thea began with the true will and the irrevocable trust, entered through Sable Whitcomb, who took the stand with her flat institutional calm and testified that she had held these documents, executed and witnessed, for 8 years, and produced the records to prove the dates. She testified about the trust, about Cora as beneficiary, about Landon as trustee, and then, with the judge's leave, she played the recording. The courtroom watched a dead woman speak. They watched Landon Ravenel, clear and dry and unmistakably herself, state her name and her sound mind, describe her true will and her trust, and then predict, calmly, looking straight into the lens, that after her death, a forged will would appear, that it would most likely be produced by her own attorney, Sinclair Beaumont, and that it should be recognized for the crime it was. When she named him, on the recording, in that dead quiet courtroom, Landon watched the blood leave Beaumont's face. Constance made a small sound. Judah stared at the screen, as though it had reached out and touched him. Then Thea turned to the paper. She called Landon, and Landon, who had spent his whole life being underestimated, took the stand and did the thing he was best in the world at, quietly and without drama. He explained watermarks and paper mills. He explained brightening agents and the dates they entered the market. He explained gel ink formulations and toner batches. He showed the photographs, the raking light and the ultraviolet, the scale bars, the ghost of the handwritten draft pressed into the margin. He testified, with the certainty of a man who authenticates manuscripts for auction houses, that the will Beaumont had filed was printed on paper manufactured months after it was supposedly signed, in ink that did not exist on the claimed date, bearing a watermark from a later run, and that it was, in his professional opinion, a forgery, and not even a careful one. Beaumont's own lawyer, hastily conferring, tried to shake him and could not, because you cannot cross-examine a paper mill's founding date. And then Thea brought out the shoebox. She called Lisbeth Farrow, and the young paralegal, still frightened but steadier now, testified to the drafts, to typing clean copies from Beaumont's handwritten versions, to being told to shred the file and shredding a decoy instead, and she produced the handwritten drafts in Beaumont's own hand, and, last, the worn birthday card with Eleanor's genuine signature, the specimen, the one Adelia had carried out of the family home. When Thea established, gently, where that card had come from, and whose hands had carried it, every head in the family row turned, slowly, toward Adelia. And in that turning, the thing that had held the conspiracy together came apart. Because Judah, staring at his wife, at the card, at the affair the evidence now made obvious, began to understand that he had been robbed not only of an inheritance, but of his marriage. That the woman beside him and the lawyer across the room had been working the whole thing together, and that he, in his hurry and his greed, had borrowed a fortune he would now never see against a lie the two of them had written. Judah stood up in open court and said his wife's name and then the lawyer's, and it was not a question, and the judge had to gavel him down. Elliot, at the end of the row, put his face in his hands, and then he did the thing his mother had said he only had to decide once. He raised his hand, and he asked to speak, and he told the judge that he wanted no part of the will, that he had suspected it was false, that his brother and sister had told him to be quiet, and that he would testify to everything he knew. The united front his siblings had presented, the wall of three, simply dissolved, in the space of a single morning, exactly as an old woman had planned that it would. Judge Merriman did not rush. He never did. But when he had heard it all, he made findings, on the record, that the document Sinclair Beaumont had filed was a forgery, that it would not be admitted, and that the true will and trust were valid. He referred the matter, in cold and specific language, to the county prosecutor, and he looked, for a long moment, at the quiet man who mended books, and at the 11-year-old girl sitting straight-backed beside him, and there was something in the old judge's face that was almost, but not quite, a smile. 5 days after the hearing, everything had changed, and it had changed with the completeness that only comes when a thing has been built patiently and sprung all at once. Sinclair Beaumont was the first to fall, and he fell hardest, because he had the most law to answer to. He was suspended within the week and disbarred within the season, stripped of the profession he had used as cover, and he was charged, on the strength of Eleanor's recording and Landon's forensics and Lisbeth's drafts, with forgery, with fraud upon the court, and with the financial exploitation of a vulnerable elder, that last charge the one that carried real prison time and real infamy, in a small state where such things were not forgotten. The affair came out completely, because such things always do once a prosecutor starts pulling threads, and Sinclair Beaumont, who had touched people's elbows and worn good suits and thought himself the cleverest man in every room, became, in the space of a season, a cautionary tale that lawyers 2 states away told each other, the man who forged a will for a woman who had recorded herself predicting he would. Judah's ruin was slower and, in a way, more complete, because it was self-inflicted, and there was no one to blame that he had not already lost. The bridge loan came due, secured against an inheritance that had evaporated the instant the true will was read, and there was nothing behind it, and the marina project, that hole in the ground he had lied about for years, finally took him all the way down. He lost it. He lost the house he and Adelia had lived in. He lost, in the divorce that followed within the month, whatever was left, because Adelia, exposed and unsentimental, took what she could and left him with the debt and the shame, and the marriage that had been built on money that never existed, ended, fittingly, in money that never existed. Judah, who had never in his life been able to wait for anything, discovered what impatience actually costs when the fortune you spent in advance turns out to have been a forgery all along. Constance did not go to jail. There was not, in the end, quite enough to charge her, though the prosecutor looked hard, and she and Beckham spent a great deal of money on lawyers making sure of that. But Constance lost the only thing she had ever truly cared about, which was her standing. In a town the size of Calderwood, the story could not be contained, that Constance Ravenel Pyle had shut off the power to her widowed brother's child while the family was burying their mother, had left a gloating note on the breaker panel, had toasted a forged will at Mario's, and had schemed to defraud a half-orphaned 11-year-old out of her inheritance. The auction house stopped returning Beckham's calls. The dinner invitations stopped. The careful life that had looked so expensive from the outside was revealed, at last, to have been anxious and hollow all along, and Constance discovered that the good address she had wanted so badly was worth nothing at all in a town where everyone knew exactly what she had done to get it. Adelia landed, as people like Adelia often do, on her feet and somewhere else, having taken what she could carry, but she landed alone. The thing she had schemed for, security purchased with someone else's fortune, she never got, because the fortune was fictional, and the lover was disbarred, and the husband was ruined. She had played a long, cold game for a prize that turned out to be a photograph of money, and she walked away from Calderwood with less than she came in with, which is its own kind of justice. Elliot was spared. He had flipped, and he had flipped in open court, and his testimony had helped, and more than that he had, at the last possible moment, decided the thing his mother said he only had to decide once. The prosecutor treated him as a witness rather than a defendant, and Landon, who could have shut the door on him too, did not. In the months after, when Elliot came again to the bindery, hat in his hands, and stood in the doorway not quite able to come in, Landon let him in. They did not become close, not the way brothers in stories become close. Too much had happened, but Landon gave him work sometimes, small honest work, and let him sit in the shop on gray afternoons, and it was more than Elliot had expected, and about what he deserved, and Eleanor, wherever she was, would have called it right. And then there was the thing that made the whole town, once it understood it, shake its head in something between horror and delight, the poetic reversal at the heart of all of it. Because when the true will and the irrevocable trust were finally, fully in force, it emerged what Cora's trust actually held. It held the downtown block on Ash Street. It held the corner building with the good brick, and in that building, on the ground floor, paying rent as it had for years, and would for years to come, was Mario's, the restaurant where Judah and Constance and Beckham and Adelia had gathered, on the night their mother was fresh in the ground, to toast a forged will and to laugh that Landon and his daughter would get nothing. They had raised their glasses in a room that belonged, though they did not know it and would not know it until it was far too late, to the very child they were toasting out of her inheritance. Every month, the rent from Mario's flowed, lawfully and irrevocably, into the trust of the 11-year-old girl they had tried to rob. The restaurant where they said the words "they get nothing" paid its rent to Cora Ravenel. There is no writer alive who would dare invent a thing that neat, and it was not invented. An old woman had simply owned the building, and known her children, and waited. Landon kept the bindery. He kept the house, the caretaker's wing and all the rest of it, held in trust for his daughter, and he ran the trust the way his mother had known he would, carefully, patiently, in her interest and no one else's. The collection stayed together, unsold. The manuscripts his mother had gathered over 40 years, kept whole for the girl who would one day inherit them outright. Cora went back to doing her homework at the little desk, under the lamp her father had rewired, with the lights on now, and the sealed letter, its work finally done, she kept anyway, in the fat dictionary, because some things you keep. And on the corner of Ash Street, the little shop with the ink-stained man inside went on mending old books and old paper, quietly, the way it always had, while the whole of Calderwood learned, slowly, the thing it had never suspected about the man who ran it, which was the same thing his mother had known all along. He was never in a hurry, and that had made him, in the end, the most dangerous man in town. It's Nathan again. I've been telling stories like this one for a while now, and people always ask me the same thing afterward, which is whether Landon should have felt guilty for waiting, for letting his brother sink deeper into that loan, for letting Constance humiliate herself all over town, for letting the crime finish before he stopped it. And I understand the question, I do, but I think it misunderstands what actually happened here. Landon didn't set the trap. His brother's greed set the trap. His sister's cruelty set the trap. That lawyer's forgery set the trap. All Landon did, and all his mother did, was decline to save those people from themselves. There's a difference between pushing someone off a cliff and simply stepping aside while they run toward one, and every single one of them was running. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. Eleanor Ravenel could have just left everything to Landon and hoped for the best. She could have written a fair will, split things evenly, tried to buy peace. And her greedy children would have torn it apart in court and worn her decent son down over years. Because that's what people like that do. They outlast decency. They count on you being too tired and too kind to fight. So she did something harder and smarter. She left it to the grandchild, in a trust they couldn't touch, held by a stranger they couldn't corrupt, and she recorded herself predicting their crime before they'd even committed it. She didn't fight her children's greed. She built a structure that turned their greed into the very thing that destroyed them. That's not revenge, exactly. That's architecture. And the patience. I said at the start that patience is the sharpest weapon there is, and I meant it. Judah couldn't wait, so he borrowed against a fortune that wasn't real. Constance couldn't wait, so she bragged before she'd won. Beaumont couldn't wait, so he forged in a hurry and left the watermark and the ink and the paper to tell on him. Every one of them lost because they couldn't sit still, and Landon won because he could. If there's one thing to take from all this, it's that when someone shows you who they are, you don't always have to react in that same moment. Sometimes the strongest thing, the winning thing, is to fold the note along its crease, put it in your pocket, and wait for the day it matters. The people rushing to hurt you are usually rushing toward their own edge. You just have to be patient enough to still be standing when they get there. That's the whole story. I'm Nathan. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you at the next one.